The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of Jack Morrison's failing ranch on Christmas Eve, and out stepped Clara Bennett, wrapped in a wool shawl against the biting Montana snow, her weathered suitcase clutched tight in her gloved hands. Jack had ordered a bride out of desperation, hoping for someone to help with cooking and mending. But Clara's pale green eyes held secrets he couldn't read, and when she stepped into his drafty cabin and saw the ledgers spread across his table, she didn't flinch at the columns of debt written in his cramped handwriting. She simply removed her shawl, rolled up her sleeves, and said something that made his heart skip, her voice steady and sure, despite the exhaustion of 3 days' travel carved into the delicate lines of her face. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. Clara's fingers moved across the ledger pages with practiced efficiency, her pale green eyes scanning the columns of numbers by the flickering light of Jack's oil lamp while he stood behind her, arms crossed over his chest, watching this stranger he'd married dissect his financial ruin with the cold precision of a surgeon examining a dying patient. And she could feel his doubt radiating like heat from a stove, could sense him questioning whether he'd made a terrible mistake, bringing an educated city woman to his failing Montana ranch. But she'd learned long ago in the marble-floored offices of her father's Boston accounting firm that numbers never lied, even when the men who manipulated them did. And these numbers screamed fraud in a language only she could read. "Mr. Morrison," she said without looking up, her voice carrying the crisp edges of her New England upbringing, despite 3 days of brutal stagecoach travel that had left her bones aching and her traveling dress stained with prairie dust. "When did you last verify the weights of your grain shipments to Samuel Pritchard's mill?" Jack shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking under his boots, and she heard the defensiveness creep into his tone before he even spoke, the way men always got when a woman pointed out something they'd missed. "Pritchard's been my buyer for 6 years, he said, and there was an edge of warning in his voice that suggested she was treading on dangerous ground. "Never had cause to doubt him. And I don't appreciate some city woman coming into my home and suggesting I've been played for a fool." Clara set down her pencil with deliberate care, finally turning to face her husband of exactly 3 hours, this tall, weathered rancher with haunted blue eyes and grief carved into every line of his sunburned face. And she understood that she was gambling everything on this moment, that if she pushed too hard she'd spend the rest of her life as nothing more than a cook and washerwoman. But if she didn't push at all, they'd lose the ranch by spring, and she'd be right back where she started, desperate and alone. "I worked as a bookkeeper for Thornton and Associates in Boston for 8 years, she said, meeting his gaze with the steady confidence that had once made her father proud before everything fell apart, before the scandal that sent her fleeing west with nothing but a borrowed suitcase, and the classified advertisement folded in her pocket like a ticket to salvation or damnation. "I kept the books for 17 different merchant accounts, and I've seen every variation of fraud that desperate or greedy men can devise, Mr. Morrison. And your Samuel Pritchard is cheating you. Has been cheating you systematically, underweighing your shipments by precisely 8% and overcharging you for processing by another 4%. Small enough margins that you'd never notice in a single transaction, but large enough that over 6 years, it adds up to the She watched his jaw tighten, watched him war with himself between pride and desperation. And then she did something that her mother would have called scandalous, reaching out to touch his calloused hand where it gripped the back of the chair. "Let me help you," she said simply, and something in her voice must have reached him because his shoulders sagged just slightly, the fight draining out of him like water from a cracked barrel. Christmas dinner was a sparse affair of salt pork, beans, and bread that Clara suspected Jack had purchased rather than baked himself. The meal laid out on a rough-hewn table in a cabin that bore all the signs of a man who'd stopped caring about the small comforts that made a house a home. And as she sat across from her new husband in the uncomfortable silence, broken only by the scrape of forks against tin plates and the howl of wind against the shutters, she noticed the empty chair beside him, the place setting that had been hastily removed but not forgotten, the ghost of his first wife Sarah hovering over them like the snow that drifted past the frosted windows. Jack ate mechanically, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder, and Clara knew he was seeing someone else, remembering other Christmas Eves when the cabin had been warm with more than just heat from the iron stove. "Sarah died 2 years ago, come February," Jack said abruptly, his voice rough as gravel, and Clara realized he'd caught her staring at the space where the missing plate had been. Fever took her in 3 days, and I've been trying to keep this place running ever since, trying to hold on to what we built together. But the debts kept piling up and the ranch kept failing, and I couldn't figure out why everything we'd worked for was crumbling to dust in my hands. He set down his fork with a clatter that seemed too loud in the small space. That's when I put the advertisement in the paper. Figured I needed help. Someone to cook and clean and maybe give Emma a woman's touch. Because the girl's been like a wild thing since her mama passed. Won't talk, won't smile. Just clutches that locket and hides in the barn like she's afraid if she gets close to anyone, they'll disappear too. Clara's heart clenched at the mention of the child she'd glimpsed only briefly. A small figure in a too large coat, who'd taken one look at Clara stepping down from the stagecoach and fled like a startled deer into the gathering dusk. Outside, Clara heard the crunch of boots on snow and caught a glimpse through the window of 2 ranch hands heading toward the bunkhouse. Their heads bent together in conversation that she suspected was about her, about the educated city woman who'd arrived with her fancy speech and her bookkeeper's eyes. "I should check on Emma," Clara said softly, rising from the table even though she knew the child didn't want her there, but she had to try. Jack's hand shot out and caught her wrist, not roughly but firmly enough to stop her. "Leave her be tonight," he said, his voice carrying a note of command that reminded Clara she was still essentially a stranger here. "She'll come around in her own time. Or she won't. But pushing her now will only make things worse." Clara nodded and sat back down, and they finished their Christmas dinner in silence, 2 strangers bound by law and desperation, while somewhere out in the barn a 7-year-old girl clutched her dead mother's locket and wished this interloper would disappear. The ride into town took 45 minutes through snow-covered trails, and Clara sat beside Jack on the wagon seat, with her recalculated ledgers wrapped in oilcloth on her lap, rehearsing in her mind exactly what she needed to say to Samuel Pritchard. The delicate balance between authority and aggression that she'd learned to walk in Boston before everything collapsed. Jack hadn't spoken since they'd left the ranch, his jaw set in that stubborn line she was beginning to recognize, and she knew he was still wrestling with whether to trust her, or whether this whole confrontation would blow up in their faces. The town of Prospect Ridge materialized out of the white landscape, false-fronted buildings lining a main street churned to mud and ice, and Clara felt the weight of curious stares as Jack pulled up in front of Pritchard's grain and feed store. Felt the way the townspeople paused to watch this drama unfold. News of Jack Morrison's mail-order bride having apparently spread through the community like wildfire. Samuel Pritchard himself stood in the doorway of his establishment, a thick-bodied man with shrewd eyes and the well-fed look of someone who prospered while his neighbors struggled, his smile too wide and too false. "Jack Morrison," Pritchard boomed with false bonhomie. "Heard you got yourself hitched. Didn't waste any time replacing poor Sarah, did you?" The casual cruelty made Jack's hands curl into fists, but Clara touched his arm gently, a silent reminder to stay focused. "Mr. Pritchard," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the street. "I've examined my husband's accounts, and I believe there are significant discrepancies in your weighing and processing charges over the past 18 months. Pritchard's smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Well now, Mrs. Morrison, that's a mighty serious accusation," he said, his tone condescending. "But I reckon you're just confused, being a city lady and all. Maybe you should let the menfolk handle these complicated matters." The crowd murmured and chuckled, and Clara felt the heat of humiliation crawl up her neck. But she'd worked too hard and come too far to be silenced by a common thief. "I have the receipts," she said, pulling the ledgers from under her arm and holding them up. "Every transaction for the past 2 years, cross-referenced with the standard market weights and processing fees published by the Montana Agricultural Board, and the discrepancies are consistent and deliberate. Mr. Pritchard, 8% underweight on shipments, and 4% overcharge on processing, which over 24 months amounts to theft of approximately $1,200 from the Morrison Ranch alone." The crowd had gone quiet now, really quiet. And Pritchard's face had gone red, his false joviality evaporating. "You calling me a thief, woman?" he snarled, taking a step toward her that Jack immediately blocked. "You come into my town and make accusations you can't possibly prove?" Clara stepped around Jack, met Pritchard's furious gaze with her own steady one. "I'm calling you exactly what you are," she said quietly, her voice nonetheless carrying to every ear. "A man who saw his neighbor's grief and used it as an opportunity to steal, who's been systematically bankrupting the ranchers in this valley so you can buy their land cheap when they fail, positioning yourself for when the railroad comes through." She saw Pritchard's eyes flicker at the mention of the railroad, saw the truth written in his suddenly ashen face. "These ledgers tell the story, Mr. Pritchard, and mathematics doesn't lie. And the truth is, you've been stealing from men who trusted you." Jack's hand found hers, squeezed once, and Clara realized he believed her, was standing with her despite the gossip it would cause. Pritchard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish drowning in air, and Clara knew she'd won this round, had exposed him in front of witnesses who would talk. "You'll regret this," Pritchard finally managed, his voice low and venomous. "Both of you." But as he turned and stormed back into his store, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, Clara felt no triumph, only the cold certainty that this was just the beginning, that they'd started something here today that would require more courage than either of them had yet imagined. Clara spread the territorial map across the kitchen table 3 nights after their confrontation with Pritchard, her finger tracing the winding route north through the Bitterroot Mountains to Fort Harrison. 60 miles of treacherous winter terrain that most sane people avoided until spring thaw made the passes navigable again. But sanity was a luxury they could no longer afford, not with the bank's foreclosure notice sitting like a death sentence on Jack's desk, giving them exactly 45 days to produce the money they owed, or lose everything to auction. "We bypass Pritchard completely," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach, despite knowing what she was proposing could get them all killed, frozen to death in some mountain pass or buried under an avalanche. But staying meant slow starvation, meant watching the ranch die by inches while Pritchard circled like a vulture. Jack's foreman Tom Hendricks, a grizzled man in his 50s who'd worked the Morrison Ranch since Jack's father had first broken ground, looked at her like she'd suggested they sprout wings and fly to the moon, his weathered face creasing with disbelief. "Mrs. Morrison, with all due respect, that route's suicide this time of year," Tom said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious danger to a child. "The passes get snowed in for days at a time, temperatures drop to 20 below, and we'd be hauling 3 wagons full of grain through terrain that'll break axles and kill horses, and one good storm could trap us up there with no shelter and no way out." Clara met his gaze without flinching, understanding his concern but also understanding that sometimes the only path forward was through the danger rather than around it. "The fort pays cash," she said quietly, tapping the ledger where she'd calculated their potential profit, numbers that represented salvation if they could just survive the journey. "Double what Pritchard offers, and they're desperate for supply before the heavy snows cut them off completely. The quartermaster said so in his notice posted at the general store." She'd been doing more than just examining Jack's books these past few days, had been talking to other ranchers' wives at Sunday service, piecing together a picture that made her blood run cold. "He's been doing this to everyone," Clara continued, pulling out the notes she'd compiled. "The Johnsons lost their place last spring to foreclosure. Pritchard bought it for pennies on the dollar. Same with the Anderson spread and the old Kelsey homestead. 5 ranches in 3 years, and now I understand why. He's been systematically cheating every rancher in this valley, driving them under so he can consolidate their properties before the Great Northern Railroad comes through next year, positioning himself to sell to the railroad at 10 times what he paid." Jack's jaw tightened as he absorbed this information, his hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough that his knuckles went white, and Clara could see him understanding that their personal struggle was part of something larger and more sinister. The attack came 4 nights later, just after midnight when the ranch was dark except for the stamping of horses in the barn and the occasional bark of the dogs that usually gave warning, but this time stayed mysteriously silent. Drugged or killed, Clara would later discover, leaving them vulnerable to the 3 men who came like shadows across the snow, their faces covered with bandanas, their intentions written in the clubs they carried as they descended on the bunkhouse where Tom and Pete Wilson slept. Clara woke to the sound of shouting and breaking glass, her heart hammering as she threw off her blankets and ran to the window in her nightgown. And through the frost-edged glass she saw figures struggling in the moonlight, saw Tom go down with blood streaming from his head, saw Pete fighting back against odds that would overwhelm him within seconds. Jack was already out of bed, pulling on his pants and reaching for the rifle he kept loaded by the door, his face grim with a violence Clara had never seen in him before. "Stay inside," he ordered, but Clara had already grabbed her shawl and the shotgun she'd found in the kitchen and taught herself to load. Having learned in her week at the ranch that frontier survival meant being prepared for anything, meant setting aside the delicate sensibilities her mother had tried to instill. The fight was brutal and brief, Jack's arrival turning the tide as his first shot sent one of the attackers fleeing into the darkness, clutching a wounded shoulder, while the other two decided retreat was preferable to facing an armed and angry rancher defending his property. Tom's head wound looked worse than it was, Clara discovered as she cleaned and bandaged it by lamplight in the kitchen, her hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "Pritchard's work," Tom muttered through gritted teeth as Clara tied off the bandage, his eyes meeting hers with new respect. "He's sending a message." But the real shock came the next morning when Clara went to draw water from the well and found it had been poisoned. Some chemical dumped in that made the water reek of kerosene and rendered it undrinkable, forcing them to haul water from the creek a quarter-mile away, adding one more hardship to their growing list of problems. Clara stood there staring at the ruined well, feeling tears of frustration and fear prick her eyes, despite her determination not to cry, but the weight of it all pressed down on her like a physical force. "Why are you crying?" The small voice made Clara spin around to find Emma standing there in her too large coat, the locket clutched in her small fist, her brown eyes wide and solemn, and Clara realized this was the first time the child had spoken directly to her. "I saw them," Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Last night, 3 men. They hurt Tom and then they did something to the well. I watched from my window but I was too scared to yell." Clara dropped to her knees in the snow, not caring about the cold seeping through her skirts, and opened her arms, offering comfort and safety. Emma hesitated for a long moment, warring with herself, and then she took 2 stumbling steps forward and collapsed into Clara's embrace, her small body shaking with sobs she'd apparently been holding in for days or weeks, or maybe even years. "You're safe," Clara whispered into Emma's tangled hair, rocking her gently. "I promise you're safe, and we're not going to let those men hurt anyone else. We're going to fight back. We're going to save the ranch and keep our family together." That night, after Jack had posted guards and secured the property as best he could, Clara sat with Emma at the kitchen table by candlelight and began teaching her numbers, simple addition and subtraction problems that Emma absorbed with surprising quickness. "Why do we need to know math?" Emma asked as she carefully wrote out sums on the slate. Clara considered how to answer, how to explain to a child that knowledge was power, that understanding numbers was what allowed her to see through Pritchard's schemes. "Because the world tries to cheat people who don't understand how it works," Clara said finally, "and I'm teaching you so that nobody can ever cheat you, so that you'll always be able to see the truth hidden in the numbers, always be able to protect yourself and the people you love." Emma looked up at her with those solemn brown eyes, and something passed between them, some understanding or acceptance, or maybe just the beginning of trust. "Can you really save the ranch?" Emma asked, her voice small and scared. Clara wanted to lie, wanted to promise absolutely that everything would be fine, but she'd learned that children deserved truth, even when truth was frightening. "I'm going to try my hardest," she said honestly. "Your father and we're going to take the grain to the fort and get the money we need, and it's going to be dangerous. But we're going to try." Emma nodded slowly, then returned to her slate, and when Emma finally fell asleep at the table, Clara carried her to bed and tucked her in, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders, the knowledge that she'd made promises she might not be able to keep. The wagons pulled out at dawn on the 28th of December, 3 heavily loaded rigs creaking under the weight of every bushel of grain the ranch had produced, and Clara sat beside Jack on the lead wagon wearing every layer of clothing she owned, which still wasn't enough for the brutal cold that would get worse as they climbed into the mountains. Tom drove the second wagon despite the bandage still wrapped around his head, while Pete Wilson handled the third, and both men had made clear through their actions that they'd decided Clara was worth following, her confrontation of Pritchard having earned their respect. The landscape transformed as they traveled north, the rolling ranch country giving way to foothills, and then to the steep-sided valleys that led into the Bitterroots, pine forests, dark against snow that grew deeper with every mile. The cold was unlike anything she'd experienced in Boston, where winter meant fashionable coats and warm carriages. But here the cold was an enemy that attacked exposed skin with invisible teeth that made every breath feel like inhaling knives. Jack watched her with sidelong glances, clearly expecting complaints or tears, but Clara had learned long ago that expectations were just another form of underestimation. The first night they camped in a clearing protected by granite outcroppings. The wagons pulled into a defensive circle, and a fire built large enough to push back the darkness, though never quite enough to make Clara feel truly warm. The wolves came just after midnight, their howls echoing through the valley in a way that made Clara's blood run cold, and she heard them circling the camp, staying just beyond the firelight. Jack pressed the rifle into her hands, giving her quick instruction on how to aim, and when the first wolf broke from the trees, Clara didn't think, just raised the rifle and fired, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, and she watched the wolf yelp and veer away, and the others retreated with it. Jack looked at her with something like wonder, as if he was seeing her for the first time. "Where did a Boston bookkeeper learn to shoot?" he asked. "My father took me hunting as a girl, before my mother decided it was unladylike," Clara said. "He said every person should know how to protect themselves, regardless of gender." They pressed on the next day, climbing higher into the passes where the snow lay 3 feet deep in places, where the wagons had to be pushed and pulled over obstacles. And Clara helped without being asked, putting her shoulder to wheels, her fashionable boots providing almost no traction, but her determination making up for her inadequate footwear. By the third day her hands were blistered, her face windburned, her entire body aching, but she never complained, just kept pushing forward because forward was the only direction that mattered. And somewhere during those brutal days, Clara Morrison stopped being a city woman playing at frontier life, and became something harder and more resilient, became someone who could save that ranch, or die trying, because she'd learned something essential about herself in the cold and the darkness. Had learned that she was stronger than she'd ever been allowed to be in Boston, strong enough to build a new life from the ashes of her old one if she could just survive long enough to see it through. The betrayal came on the 4th day, high in the narrowest part of the pass, where the trail squeezed between vertical rock walls and a drop that fell away into nothing, the kind of place where one wrong move could send a wagon tumbling into the abyss. And Clara was walking beside the lead wagon to spare the horses her weight, when she heard the crack of splintering wood and saw the second wagon lurch violently to one side, its rear axle giving way in a manner that seemed too catastrophic to be simple wear, too perfectly timed to be accident, and Pete Wilson jumped clear just before the wagon tipped, the grain sacks tumbling into the snow, as Tom rushed to grab the horses' bridles and keep them from panicking and dragging the whole rig over the edge. But in the chaos that followed, Clara saw Pete running, not toward the damaged wagon but away from it, scrambling up the rocky slope with the desperate speed of a man fleeing judgment. And she understood with cold clarity that he'd been Pritchard's spy all along, had sabotaged the axle at some point during the previous night's camp, and now was abandoning them to their fate in the mountains where no witnesses would see and no law would care about what happened to a failing rancher and his mail-order bride. Jack shouted after the fleeing man but didn't pursue. Couldn't pursue because the wagon was tipping dangerously toward the cliff edge, and every second counted, and together he and Tom managed to unhitch the horses and pull them clear just before the whole rig went over, taking half their grain with it, tumbling end over end down the mountainside, in a catastrophic loss that would have meant the end of everything, if not for the 2 remaining wagons, and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The blizzard hit within the hour. Wind-driven snow so thick Clara couldn't see her own hands in front of her face, temperature dropping so fast that frost formed on her eyelashes, and her breath came in painful gasps that burned her lungs. And Jack was shouting something about finding shelter, but his words were torn away by the howling wind. And Clara knew with terrible certainty that they were going to die here, frozen in some nameless mountain pass, their bodies not found until spring thaw revealed what was left of their desperate gamble. But then she remembered something her father had taught her years ago when he'd taken her surveying, how to read the land and understand how water carved the earth, how rock formations indicated caves and overhangs. And through the whiteout she spotted a dark shadow against the cliff face that might be nothing or might be salvation. And she grabbed Jack's arm and pointed. not bothering to explain because there was no time for explanation, only action, only the desperate hope that her city-bred education might save their frontier lives. The abandoned mining camp huddled in a box canyon protected from the worst of the wind. 3 collapsing structures and the remains of sluice equipment, testament to some long-ago prospector's dreams of gold that had come to nothing, but the largest building still had most of its roof intact, and a stone fireplace that drew properly when Jack got a fire going with trembling hands. And they hauled the remaining grain inside and settled the horses in what had once been a storage shed, and somehow, impossibly, they survived the night, while Pete Wilson's frozen body was later found by Fort soldiers 3 days hence. His flight into the storm, having been his last and fatal mistake, Pritchard's silver buying him nothing but a lonely death in the Montana wilderness. They reached Fort Harrison on New Year's Day, half frozen and exhausted but alive, with 2 wagons of grain instead of 3, but enough to make the difference between survival and ruin. And the Army quartermaster, a practical man named Captain Richards, who cared more about feeding his men than about social niceties or the gender of who negotiated with him, took one look at Clara's detailed manifests with their precise weights and fair pricing, and offered not just to buy their current supply but to establish an ongoing contract that would bypass Pritchard entirely, providing the Morrison Ranch with a reliable buyer and fair prices that would let them rebuild what had been lost and then some. Clara negotiated terms while Jack watched in something like amazement, her Boston education and her father's business sense combining to extract concessions that a simple rancher would never have thought to ask for: premium rates for winter delivery and guaranteed purchases for the next 3 years, volume commitments that would stabilize their income and allow for expansion, terms that would not just save the ranch but make it prosperous. And when she finally shook hands with Captain Richards, sealing the deal that represented their salvation, she saw in Jack's eyes something she'd been afraid to hope for. Something that looked remarkably like love, or at least the beginning of it. Respect and admiration, and the dawning realization that this marriage of convenience might become something far more meaningful than either of them had dared imagine. The ride home took 4 days because he could travel faster without the heavy loads, and somewhere during those days Clara and Jack talked in ways they hadn't before, really talked about Sarah and the grief that still lived in Jack's heart but no longer consumed it. About Clara's scandal in Boston and the bookkeeper who'd taken advantage of her trust and left her holding the blame for his embezzlement, about Emma and the future and what kind of partnership they might build from the ashes of their separate desperation. And Clara learned that grief didn't have to be overcome to make room for new feeling, that Jack could love Sarah's memory and still be open to loving again, differently but no less real. And she shared her own story of betrayal and shame, how she'd trusted the wrong man with access to her father's accounts, and paid the price when he vanished with the money and left her reputation in ruins, why she'd fled west with nothing but a borrowed suitcase and the classified advertisement for a mail-order bride that had seemed like her only remaining option. They arrived back at the ranch to find Sheriff Miller waiting with Pritchard in custody and Emma standing proud beside him, her small chin lifted with defiance and courage that made Clara's heart swell with pride. And the story that emerged was almost too perfect to believe. That while they'd been gone, Pritchard had tried to claim the ranch through some legal maneuvering involving the foreclosure notice and corrupt banking officials. But Emma had remembered the lessons Clara had taught her about reading contracts and understanding numbers, had found the letter Clara had written before leaving that detailed Pritchard's fraud with copies of all the evidence, and had presented it to the sheriff with the kind of courage that reminded Clara painfully of herself at that age, before the world had taught her to be cautious and afraid. The community had turned against Pritchard once the evidence was made public, other ranchers coming forward with their own stories of suspicious dealings and unexplained debts, wives who'd noticed discrepancies but been dismissed when they raised concerns, families who'd lost everything and never understood why, until Clara's meticulous bookkeeping revealed the pattern of systematic theft, and the scope of Pritchard's conspiracy had unraveled, like poorly made rope under tension, revealing years of fraud that had destroyed families and stolen futures, all in service of one man's greed and his scheme to consolidate ranch properties before the railroad came through and made the land valuable. And now he would face justice in territorial court while his ill-gotten properties were seized to compensate his victims. Clara knelt in the snow and opened her arms, and Emma ran into them without hesitation. This child, who'd lost one mother and been brave enough to trust another, who'd stood up to a corrupt merchant and saved their home through nothing but courage and the mathematics, Clara had taught her by candlelight, and they held each other while Jack stood watching with tears freezing on his weathered cheeks. And Clara understood that this was what family looked like. Not the bloodlines and social connections her Boston upbringing had valued, but this messy, complicated, hard-won choice to stand together against whatever came next, to build something real from the rubble of their separate losses. That night, with Emma asleep in her bed clutching both her mother's locket and the new hair ribbon Clara had bought her at the fort, Jack took Clara's hand across the kitchen table and said the words she'd been afraid to need. Told her that she'd saved more than just the ranch, and that she'd saved him and Emma from drowning in grief and defeat, that her arrival on that snowy Christmas Eve had been the answer to prayers he'd been too broken to even know he was praying. And Clara felt something ease in her chest, some tight knot of fear and inadequacy that had lived there since Boston, since the scandal that sent her fleeing west, and she understood that sometimes salvation came dressed as desperation, that sometimes the worst moments of your life were actually doorways to something better, if you were brave enough to walk through them and strong enough to build something new on the other side. They used their new prosperity to help the other ranchers Pritchard had cheated, offering fair prices for grain, and connecting them with Captain Richards for their own contracts, building the kind of community that looked out for each other rather than competed to destruction. And Clara found purpose not just in bookkeeping, but in teaching other ranch wives to read contracts and understand their finances, empowering them with knowledge that made them harder to cheat and impossible to dismiss. Spring came early that year, melting the snow to reveal green grass and new possibilities, and on a warm April evening Clara stood on the porch, watching Emma play with the new foal, while Jack worked on finishing repairs to the poisoned well, and she thought about how far she'd traveled, not just the miles from Boston to Montana, but the internal distance between who she'd been and who she'd become, and from desperate mail-order bride running from scandal to partner and mother, and the woman who'd saved a struggling ranch with nothing but mathematics and courage, and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat as inevitable. Emma called her mama now without hesitation or grief, and Jack looked at her with eyes that held not just gratitude but genuine affection, the slow-burning kind that built over shared hardship and mutual respect, rather than the passionate whirlwind of first love. And Clara understood that she'd found something in this wild Montana country that Boston society could never have given her, had found herself reflected not in social standing or family reputation, but in the work of her hands and the strength of her spirit, in the family she'd chosen and the second chance she'd seized with both hands and refused to let go, standing tall in the golden light of a frontier evening with the ranch lights glowing warm behind her, the mail-order bride who'd arrived with hidden talents and a determination to survive, who'd faced down corruption and mountain passes and her own limitations to build something worth having, and her future finally, gloriously her own to shape however she desired.